If your phone ever rings at 2:14 a.m., don't answer it. Please don't. It doesn't matter who you think it might be, a friend, a mistake, a harmless curiosity. Whatever you're imagining, it's worse than that. And once you pick up, there's no undoing it. I know because I answered. At first, it was nothing. A voice, faint and crackling, buried beneath layers of static. But it wasn't just a voice. It knew things about me, things no one could know. It reached into the places I thought I'd locked away, the memories I buried deep. And now, it's everywhere. It doesn't stop. So if your phone rings at 2:14 a.m., promise me one thing. Don't let curiosity win. Don't pick up. Because once you do, it's already too late. My name's Alex. I've always been a night owl. Something about the stillness of the world after midnight feels timeless. Like the rest of the world is asleep and I'm the only one left to witness it. That's why the midnight shift at the station suited me so perfectly. A small-town radio station. Nothing fancy. Just an old, creaky building on the edge of nowhere, tucked behind a line of trees that seemed taller at night. Inside, it was quiet, lit by the warm glow of old equipment and scattered with stacks of vinyl records. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My refuge. My escape. I liked the simplicity of it. Playing music, talking to whoever might be listening out there. Maybe it was truckers on the highway, or someone alone in a dark room, looking for a connection. It made me feel like I mattered, even in the smallest way. But if I'm honest, the station was more than just a job. It was a way to get away from everything else. A way to forget. Forget the lake, the cold water pulling at my legs, the weight of silence when I thought I wouldn't make it back to the surface. The nights were usually uneventful. Music, lukewarm coffee, and the occasional call. Some were requests, others just lonely voices wanting to talk. I liked being the voice in the dark, but then there was that night. It was a Wednesday, just past midnight. I was queuing up the next song, the smell of burnt coffee thick in the air, when the phone rang. It startled me. The sound was sharp, heavier than it should have been, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Calls were normal during my shift, but something about this one felt wrong. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. A part of me wanted to let it ring, but curiosity got the better of me. Midnight mix with Alex. What can I do for you? At first, there was nothing. Just a faint hum, like the buzz of a far-off storm. Then, beneath the static, I heard it. A voice. Low, raspy, like someone trying to sound human but not quite getting it right. It's already started. Do you hear it, Alex? I froze. My name, it said my name. Who is this? The static flared, sharp and electric, as if the line itself was alive. The voice came again, lower this time, almost a whisper. The fire, it will happen again. My chest tightened. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice shaking. Is this some kind of joke? Who are you? No answer, just static. And then a faint click. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the receiver like it might come to life again. The hum of the dial tone filled my ears, but it didn't feel real. None of it did. I told myself it had to be a prank, some weirdo trying to scare me. That's all it was, right? I went through the rest of the shift on autopilot, playing songs, reading ads, pretending everything was normal. But in the back of my mind, the voice lingered. The fire, it will happen again. By the time my shift ended at 4, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing, something I could laugh about later. But the unease clung to me, like smoke you can't shake off. And then, the news broke. An old schoolhouse on the edge of town had burned to the ground that night. The place had been abandoned for years, but the timing, the coincidence, it hit me like a punch to the gut. The fire, it will happen again. I told myself it was just that, a coincidence. Fires happen, creepy calls happen. They weren't connected, they couldn't be. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment everything began. That was the first crack in the surface. And if I'd just ignored that call, if I'd let it ring, I might not be here now trying to warn you. But I didn't. And what came next? I wasn't ready for it. If you're listening to this, I need you to understand. That first call wasn't random. It wasn't just some ghost story waiting to be forgotten. It was a warning, a doorway, the beginning of something I can't even begin to explain. But if your phone ever rings at 2:14 a.m., promise me you'll let it ring. Because if you pick up, you'll understand. And by then, it'll already be too late. I thought it was over. After the first call, after the fire, I convinced myself it was just coincidence. Fires happen, right? That's all it was. But I couldn't shake the voice. The fire, it will happen again. The words followed me everywhere. They clung to me in the silence of the night and echoed in the hum of the station. And when I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of it. The flames, the schoolhouse, the blackened walls crumbling like paper. But the fire wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was what came after, because the fire wasn't the end. The next night I did everything the same. Coffee, records, the same tired ads I read without thinking. The studio felt heavier, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I wouldn't let that call get to me. Then at exactly 2:14 a.m., the phone rang. I froze. My fingers hovered over the buttons on the console, trembling. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring and ring until it stopped. But that same pull was there. The same horrible curiosity that made me pick up the first time. Midnight mix with Alex. At first, nothing. Just static, faint and crackling, wrapping around the silence like a shroud. And then the voice. It's not the fire you should fear. Who is this? What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I wasn't steady. I wasn't even close. It's what it left behind, it whispered. My heart felt like it stopped. The words didn't make sense, but they didn't have to. There was something in them, something heavy, dark, like a weight pressing on my chest. What are you talking about? I demanded. The static flared again, sharp and alive, filling the studio with a sound that felt too big for the room. And then the voice spoke one last time. Look outside. I didn't want to look. I told myself I wouldn't. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my problem. It wasn't real. But something made me move. Something deep in my chest, pulling me toward the window. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water, but I couldn't stop. At first, the parking lot looked the same as always. Empty, quiet. The glow of the streetlights stretched across the asphalt, casting long, empty shadows. Then I saw them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the light. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. Or at least, I think they were watching. I couldn't see their faces. I couldn't see anything except their outlines, blurry and rippling like heat waves rising off the pavement. Their limbs were too long, bending in ways that didn't make sense. And their heads tilted, twitching slightly, as though they were trying to figure out what I was. There was something on them, something glowing faintly in the dark. Symbols, etched into their forms, burning like embers in the shadows. I blinked, and they were gone. The lot was empty again. The shadows were still, but I knew they hadn't really left. I sat back down at the console, my chest tight, my hands shaking. I tried to focus, to play another record, but my mind wouldn't let me. It's not the fire you should fear, it's what it left behind. What did it leave behind? I tried to push the thought away, but it wouldn't leave. And then the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but my hand moved before I could stop it. Do you remember the lake, Alex? The words hit me like a punch. The lake. The cold water pulling me under, my lungs burning, the silence so heavy it felt like I was drowning all over again. How do you know that? I whispered. The voice laughed, low and hollow, like wind through dead leaves. I've always known, it said. I was there. I slammed the phone down, but it didn't matter. I could still hear it. The static, the voice, whispering things I didn't want to hear, things I didn't want to remember. The next morning, I found it. A mark, faint and jagged, carved into the edge of the console. At first, I thought it was just a scratch, something left behind by years of use. But the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. A symbol, sharp and unnatural like the ones I'd seen on the figures. It wasn't the last one. Over the next few days, they started appearing everywhere. On the desk, on the walls, even on the window. Faint at first, like shadows burned into the glass. But as the days went on, they grew brighter, more alive. And then one night I saw it on my skin. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A jagged line, carved into my forearm like it had been burned there. I scrubbed at it until my skin was raw, but it didn't fade. It didn't even hurt. It just existed, and I could feel it, pulsing, alive. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The figures, the symbols, the flames. Every shadow in my apartment felt heavier. Every sound seemed wrong. The phone rang even when it wasn't plugged in. Static buzzed in my ears, even in silence. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw things that shouldn't have been there. My reflection didn't move the way it should have. Its eyes didn't look like mine. And sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving behind it, just out of reach. I knew I was losing it. But the worst part was knowing it wasn't just in my head. The fire, the crash, the figures, the symbols, they were all connected. All part of something I couldn't understand. And every time the phone rang, every time I heard that voice, it brought me closer to it. Closer to whatever it wanted from me. It wasn't finished. Not yet. But I could feel it pulling me in. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to stop. The station wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't even a place I could leave behind when my shift ended. It had become something else. Something alive. Something that followed me home, whispered in my mind, etched its marks into my skin. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the records, the calls, the routine, but I couldn't. The symbols wouldn't let me. The phone wouldn't let me. And the figures wouldn't let me forget. So one night, I decided to stop running. I stayed after my shift, the glow of the studio lights dimming as I made my way to the back room, the part of the station I'd always avoided. The air there felt different, thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. And that's where I found it. The back room was a mess, piles of old papers, broken equipment, and dust that seemed to cling to the air itself. At first, I didn't think I'd find anything, it just looked like junk. But then, buried under a stack of forgotten records, I found the folder. Its label was faded, the ink barely legible, midnight shift complaints. Inside, the pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting scrawled and frantic. At first, it seemed harmless enough, equipment malfunction, strange static cutting into broadcasts. But as I kept reading, the reports grew darker. The phone rang, but no one was there. Just static. And then, a laugh. I keep seeing things in the corner of my eye, shadows moving when they shouldn't. It's not just the calls, it's the station itself. I think it's alive. Some of the DJs had left in a hurry, their resignation letters scrawled in shaky handwriting. I can't take it anymore. The phone won't stop ringing, and then one that stopped me cold. I won't be next. At the back of the folder I found the police reports, missing persons cases, all tied to former DJs who'd worked the midnight shift. Decades of them gone without a trace. The station had been swallowing people for years. I don't know why I kept digging. Maybe I thought there was still some explanation that would make this all make sense. But what I found next only made it worse. In the bottom drawer of a rusted filing cabinet, I found a box. It was small, battered, and covered in dust. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape, its label marked simply 1974, midnight broadcast. I took it to the studio, threading it onto the playback machine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe static, maybe silence, but what I heard. At first it was just the usual hiss of static, faint and crackling. Then came the voice. It's happening again. My stomach dropped. It was the same voice I'd heard on the calls, low, rasping, wrong. The tape crackled and then the voice spoke again. "Do you hear it, Alex? My name." It said my name. I rewound the tape, played it again, desperate to convince myself I'd misheard. But it was there, clear as day. "Do you hear it, Alex?" How could this tape, recorded decades before I'd even been born, know my name? And then, as if the tape itself could feel my fear, it began to warp. The static grew louder, more jagged, until it felt like it was inside me, scraping against my thoughts. And then, faintly, beneath it all, I heard something else. Laughter. Hollow, distant, but unmistakable. When I finally turned the tape off, the room felt smaller, like the walls had shifted closer. And that's when I saw it. The symbols, carved into the wooden beams above the studio door. Faint, jagged lines I hadn't noticed before. They pulsed faintly as if they were alive. After that, the symbols started appearing everywhere. On my desk, on my chair, on the edges of my notebooks. At first, I thought they were scratches, marks I'd simply overlooked. But they weren't. They were deliberate, intentional. One night, I took a UV light to the studio just to see if there was more I hadn't noticed. And there was. The symbols lit up like a map, crisscrossing every surface, forming patterns I couldn't understand. And then I looked at my arm. The marks weren't just appearing around me, they were appearing on me. Lines etched into my skin, faint but undeniable. They didn't hurt, they didn't even feel real. but I could sense them, shifting, pulsing, like they were part of me now. I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep going back to the station, knowing it was watching me, marking me, pulling me deeper into whatever it was. I needed answers. And that's when I heard about Elijah. He lived on the outskirts of town, in a house swallowed by the woods. People said he was strange, unhinged. But they also said he knew things no one else would talk about. When I found him, he was sitting on his porch, his eyes sharp and knowing, like he'd been expecting me. "You work at the station?" I nodded, unsure of how to begin. "It's been waiting for you." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. "The land it's built on," he said, "has been cursed for centuries. Long before the station, the settlers used it for rituals. They carved symbols into the trees, drew patterns in the dirt, and called to something they didn't understand. Called to what? Something ancient, something hungry. Elijah told me the settlers had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the symbols and stories of strange lights in the woods. Decades later, when the station was built, it wasn't an accident. The station was designed to amplify the signal, he said, to keep the ritual alive. Every midnight broadcast, it's not just music, it's a call to the other side. I felt sick, the thought of it, of all those nights I'd spent sitting there, playing records, sending out that signal. Why me? Why is it targeting me? The station chooses, he said. It always chooses someone, and once it chooses you, there's no way out. I wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but I knew he wasn't. Before I left, Elijah gave me one last warning. The station isn't just haunted, it's alive and it doesn't let go. I drove back to town, Elijah's words looping in my mind like a broken record. The station had chosen me. And now, no matter what I did, it wouldn't let me go. The symbols were spreading. The calls were getting louder. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to escape. The symbols were everywhere now. On the walls of the studio, etched faintly into my desk, flickering in the corners of my vision, like they were hiding just beyond the edge of the light. They weren't just appearing anymore, they were growing, spreading, and they weren't just around me, they were on me. The first one had been faint, a thin, jagged line on my forearm that I told myself was nothing, but by the next morning, it wasn't faint anymore. It had grown thicker, sharper, and it wasn't alone. The marks were changing, shifting every time I looked away. They pulsed faintly, like something alive, and when I touched them, they burned, not with pain, but with a heat that felt like it was coming from inside me. I knew I couldn't ignore them. I needed answers, and the station wasn't going to give them to me. The library wasn't much, just a single room packed with dusty books and old records, but it was the only place I could think of to start. If the station was built on something, if the land itself was tied to the symbols, then maybe I could find something here. I started with the town's history, combing through old documents, maps, and ledgers. At first, it was the usual small-town stuff, births, deaths, marriages. But then I found the account of the settlers. In 1834, a group of settlers arrived on the land where the town now stands. They were farmers, seeking fertile soil and a fresh start, but their time here was short. The record didn't explain much, just that they vanished. One day they were here, and the next they were gone. Their camp was abandoned, their belongings left behind, and the only thing anyone found were strange carvings in the trees. Symbols, jagged, intersecting lines, glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was the same pattern, the same marks I'd seen on the station, on me. And then there was the story of their voices. Travelers passing through the area reported hearing voices in the woods. Whispers, faint and distant, calling out names, sometimes their own. The document ended there, the rest of the page torn away, but I didn't need more. I could feel it, like the symbols themselves were crawling through the paper, reaching for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the symbols, felt their weight pressing against my skin. And when I finally looked down at my arm, I realized why. The marks weren't just growing, they were moving. The lines twisted and shifted, forming new patterns that pulsed faintly in the dark. And when I touched them, the heat flared again, stronger this time, burning up my arm like fire. It wasn't just heat, it was something else. A sound. Faint, just beneath my skin, a hum like static vibrating through my bones. I tried to scrub them off, but it didn't matter. The marks didn't fade. If anything, they seemed brighter, sharper, like they were mocking me for trying. The next morning, I couldn't stay in my apartment. The air felt heavy, like the walls were closing in, and the static in my head wouldn't stop. I needed to get out, to feel normal again, even if it was just for a moment. I went to the diner, one of those small-town places that hadn't changed in 50 years. The smell of coffee and grease was almost comforting, almost enough to make me forget. Almost. The waitress brought my coffee without a word. She didn't even look at me, just set the mug down and walked away. And that's when I saw it. The mark, faint and jagged, etched into the back of her hand. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was a scar, a trick of the light. But then she turned back, her eyes meeting mine, and I knew it wasn't. Her eyes weren't right. They were dark, empty, like the voids where the figures' faces should have been. And when she spoke, her voice was flat, monotone. "You shouldn't be here, Alex." I didn't stay to finish my coffee. After that, I started noticing them everywhere. The marks, on hands, on necks, on the edges of collars where they couldn't quite be hidden. And it wasn't just the marks, it was the way they moved, the way their heads tilted slightly when they saw me, the way their eyes lingered just a little too long. They weren't normal. None of them were. And the worst part, they knew I wasn't either. I went back to the library, desperate for more. I found an old journal tucked away in a box of forgotten records, its pages brittle with age. It belonged to one of the settlers, a woman named Eleanor. Her writing started out hopeful, full of plans for the future. But as the entries went on, her tone shifted. The land, it's different here. The air feels heavier, thicker, and at night we hear things, voices, not our own. The later entries were harder to read. Her handwriting grew erratic, the words breaking off mid-sentence. But the last entry stopped me cold. We thought we could control it. We were wrong. The symbols aren't protection. They're a door. Eleanor's journal ended there. No explanation, no closure, just a single jagged symbol scrawled across the last page. I left the library with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The symbols weren't random. They were part of something bigger, something older. And somehow I was part of it too. The settlers had opened a door, and the station had kept it open. Every broadcast, every midnight shift, every record I played, it wasn't just music. It was a signal, a call. And now the symbols were spreading, the marks were growing, the voices were getting louder. Whatever the settlers had started, whatever the town had been built on, it wasn't finished yet. And I was running out of time. It wasn't just the symbols anymore. It wasn't just the phone calls or the figures lurking in the dark. This time, it was different. This time, it knew me. Not just my name. Not just the surface-level details anyone could guess. It knew everything. The things I never told anyone. The things I didn't even let myself think about. And it wasn't just calling to haunt me. It was calling to claim me. The first call came just after 2:14 a.m., like it always did. By then, I knew better than to ignore it. Ignoring it didn't make it stop. Nothing did. Midnight mix with Alex. At first, there was the usual static, sharp and crackling, wrapping itself around the silence like a net. But then the voice came through, low, raspy, familiar. "Do you still dream about the lake?" My breath caught in my throat. The lake, the water pulling at my legs, the cold swallowing me whole. I hadn't told anyone about that. I hadn't even thought about it in years. "You were 9, it continued, as if reading my thoughts. "You thought you were going to die. You screamed, but no one heard you." "How do you know that?" I whispered. "I've always known, Alex. I've been watching you for a long time." I slammed the phone down, but it didn't matter. I could still hear it. The voice wasn't just on the line. It was in the room, in my head, crawling under my skin. The studio felt different after that call. The air was thicker, heavier, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I tried to focus, to get back to work, but the shadows were too loud. I caught movement in the corner of my eye and turned to the window. At first, it was just my reflection staring back at me, but then it moved. It didn't move like I did. It turned its head slower, its eyes darker, and then it smiled. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my breath coming in short gasps. When I looked again, it was gone. Just my reflection, normal and still, but I knew what I'd seen. The phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't even want to look at it, but the sound, it filled the room, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my chest. It wouldn't stop until I picked up. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to talk, Alex. Don't you want to talk about the tree?" The tree. I hadn't thought about that in years. The old oak behind my childhood home, the one I fell from when I was 10. The crack of my legs snapping, the scream that ripped out of me, the way the world spun as I hit the ground. "It hurt, didn't it?" the voice asked. "You thought you'd never walk again, but you didn't cry, not in front of them. You waited until you were alone." "Stop," I whispered. "Stop it. You never told anyone how scared you were. You buried it, just like everything else. But I remember, Alex. I remember it all." I slammed the phone down again, but it didn't matter. The voice wasn't on the line anymore. It was in me. The symbols started appearing again, but they weren't like before. They weren't carved into the walls or etched into the desk. They were moving, shifting through the air like ink spilled in water. They twisted and writhed, forming patterns that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. And when I reached out to touch them, my fingers burned, not from heat, but from something colder, sharper, like ice cutting into my skin. The marks on my arm flared, their lines glowing faintly, twisting into new shapes that I couldn't understand. They weren't just symbols anymore, they were alive. And somehow, I knew they were a message, a warning, or maybe a promise. The last call came just before the end of my shift. By then, I didn't even bother pretending it wasn't going to happen. I just sat there, waiting for it, the hum of the phone already buzzing in my ears before it even rang. When I picked up, the voice didn't waste any time. "Do you know what you're afraid of, Alex? You think it's the station, the symbols, the shadows, but it's not." It paused, letting the words sink in. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. "You're afraid of what happens next, of what happens when there's nothing left of you but the static." "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not afraid of you." "Oh, Alex," it said, almost lovingly. "You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of how much of me is already in you." The line went dead, but I didn't hang up. I just sat there, the receiver pressed to my ear, listening to the static hum like a heartbeat. When the sun came up, I left the station. I didn't go home. I didn't go anywhere. I just drove, the marks on my skin glowing faintly in the light, the symbols still bleeding into the air around me. It wasn't just the calls. It wasn't just the voice. It was everything. The station, the symbols, the memories I'd buried, the parts of me I thought I'd left behind. It knew them all, and now it wasn't just watching me, it was becoming me, and I didn't know how much of me was left. It wasn't just the calls anymore. It wasn't just the symbols or the whispers or the way the shadows seemed to breathe. It was everything. The station wasn't just part of my life, it was my life now. I could feel it in every breath, every thought. Its weight pressed against me, suffocating, and no matter where I went, it followed. But that night, it didn't follow. That night, it pulled. The phone rang at 2:14 a.m. like always, but this time the sound was different, louder, deeper. It wasn't just a phone ringing, it was the air, the walls, the floor, everything vibrating with that single endless chime. I didn't want to answer it, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Midnight mix with Alex. "It's time," the voice said. "Come and see." "See what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" "Everything." The line went dead, but the sound didn't stop. The chime grew louder, deeper, until it felt like it was pulling me apart. And then everything shifted. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't like falling asleep or slipping into a dream. It was instant. One moment, I was sitting at the console, the glow of the studio lights warm against my skin. The next, I was somewhere else entirely. The walls were gone. The floor was gone. The studio had unraveled, stretched into a vast, endless space that hummed with energy. The air shimmered, heavy with sound waves that rippled and pulsed, forming shapes I couldn't quite understand. At first they were abstract, lines and curves bending in ways that made my head ache. But then they shifted, twisted, and I realized what I was looking at. Memories. They weren't just mine. They weren't even mine first. They were everything. Flashes of lives I didn't recognize, faces I'd never seen, voices overlapping in a chaotic, endless loop. And then in the middle of it all, I saw myself. I saw the lake, the tree, the studio, the marks on my arm glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't just watching me, it had always been watching me. From the moment I was born, maybe even before. The station wasn't just part of me, I was part of it. The sound waves shifted again, twisting into something else. The space around me pulsed, alive with light and shadow, and in the center of it all was the station's heart. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't something I could even describe in human terms. It pulsed like a living thing, its surface shimmering with static that rippled outward in waves. Symbols flickered across it, glowing and fading, their jagged lines forming patterns that burned into my eyes. It didn't just hum, it spoke. Not with words, but with something deeper. Something that crawled into my mind and wrapped itself around my thoughts. You're the one, Alex. You've always been the one. The light shifted again, and this time it was sharper, clearer. The shapes solidified into scenes, moments pulled straight from my life. I saw myself as a child, sitting by the lake, my reflection rippling in the water. I saw the tree, the way its branches twisted against the sky as I fell. I saw the station, glowing faintly in the distance, like it had been waiting for me all along. Every moment I thought I'd left behind, every fear I thought I'd buried, it was all here, laid out in front of me. And the symbols, they weren't just on me anymore. They were in me. Etched into every memory, every thought, every part of who I was. The station hadn't just marked me, it had shaped me. It had been pulling me toward this moment my entire life. The static flared again, louder this time, sharper, until it felt like it was splitting me apart. And then the voice spoke. You understand now, don't you? You were never meant to escape. Why me? I asked. Why is this happening to me? The station chooses, it always chooses. And now it has chosen you. The air around me grew colder, heavier, and I felt them before I saw them. The figures stepped out of the shadows, their limbs too long, their faces blank voids. But they weren't just shadows anymore. They were solid now, more real than they'd ever been, their forms flickering with static as they moved. You can join us, Alex, or you can refuse. It let the words hang in the air, but I knew it wasn't giving me a real choice. The figures moved closer, their shapes twisting and shifting, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the dark. What happens if I refuse? I whispered. Then there will be nothing left of you but the static. No body, no mind, just an echo in the signal. And if I say yes, then you'll become something more. You'll become part of the station, part of the signal. You'll never be alone again. The figures were closer now, their outlines blurring into mine, their symbols glowing brighter. And I realized I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I was afraid of how much I already belonged to them. The static grew louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. The memories twisted and blurred, folding in on themselves, and the figures reached for me, their hands cold and endless. I wanted to fight, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The station had me. It had always had me. And as I stepped forward into the heart of the station, I realized I didn't want to escape. I thought it would be different. I thought once I stepped into the station's heart, once I embraced it, everything would make sense. But it didn't. It only got worse. I thought I was in control. That by choosing to join, to give myself over, I would finally understand what was happening. But the more I let go, the more the station swallowed me whole. And now I'm not sure if I'm still me. The first night, it was almost like nothing had changed. I woke up in the same room, the same bed, but there was something off. Something I couldn't put my finger on. I sat up, the room colder than it had ever been, and that's when I heard it. The phone. Ringing. It shouldn't have been ringing. I hadn't plugged it back in, I hadn't even touched it. But there it was, filling the room with that slow, deliberate chime, like it had been waiting for me to answer. Midnight Mix with Alex. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. But the ringing wouldn't stop. It echoed in my mind, vibrating through my chest, my limbs, until I felt it in my bones. And then I picked it up. It's time. I don't know what I expected to hear. Maybe a confirmation that I'd made the right choice, that I was free of it all. But instead, it was a voice. The same voice I had heard so many times before, but this time it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me. Do you hear it? It whispered. Do you hear the call? The call. I knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just the phone. It wasn't just the station. It was the signal. The one that had been broadcast to me my whole life, pulling me in, shaping me, marking me. And now, it was my turn to call. The next night, I sat by the phone, waiting for it to ring. I knew it would. Knew I couldn't stop it. But now, it wasn't just something that happened to me. I was the one pulling the strings. When the phone rang, I picked it up without hesitation. "Midnight Mix with Alex," I said, my voice strange, distant. It didn't sound like mine anymore, and then the voice came through. It was the same voice, but now it felt like something more, like it was feeding off my words. "Do you remember the lake, Alex?" I felt a chill run through me. The lake, the one I tried to forget, the one the voice had always known about. But this time it wasn't asking, it wasn't reminding me. It was using me, pulling me into something new, something darker. I tried to fight it, but it was too late. The symbols on my skin burned brighter, more real than before, and the static in my head grew louder, sharper, until I thought my mind would snap. I don't know how much time passed. Days? Hours? I couldn't keep track. It didn't matter anymore. The station had a rhythm, a pulse that I couldn't escape. Every night I answered the phone. Every night the same words, the same ritual. The call would come and I would answer. "Midnight Mix with Alex." And then I'd speak the words. I'd call out to whoever was listening, drawing them in just like I had been drawn in. I don't even remember their faces anymore. I don't remember their names, but I hear their voices now, faint and distant, calling to me from the other side. And it feels so familiar, like I've done this 1,000 times before. I'm not sure if I'm still Alex. I don't know what's left of me. The station is part of me now, inside me, twisting everything I thought I knew. I can feel it deep in my chest, the pull, the connection. I hear the ringing, feel the static, see the marks spreading across my skin like cracks in glass. I thought I could escape. I thought I could fight it. But now I understand. There's no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. Because once the station calls you, once it chooses you, you belong to it forever, and the cycle will continue. It's been months now. Months since I made the choice. Months since I crossed that line and stepped into the station's heart. I thought it would be different. I thought I would understand everything, finally see the truth, see the pattern. But now I don't know if I'm the one telling the story, or if the story's telling me. I don't recognize myself anymore. The changes started small at first. Little things I told myself I was imagining. My voice crackling like static when I spoke. My skin feeling colder. But now it's more than that. It's everywhere, inside me, under my skin. I wake up in the same place, in the same bed, but it feels wrong. The air is thicker now, almost suffocating, like I'm trapped in a dream I can't wake from. And when I move, the symbols follow. They're faint at first, like shadows lingering behind me. But the longer I walk, the more I notice them. Etched into the floorboards beneath my feet, in the dust on the shelves, in the reflections of the windows. As if the very ground beneath me is turning into something else. And when I speak, the static is there. Low. Under my words, like a hum I can't escape. "Midnight Mix with Alex," I say, and I almost don't recognize my own voice anymore. It's flat. It's distant. It sounds like it's coming from somewhere far away. The station has seeped into me. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. It moves through me like a pulse, like electricity, like it's never going to let go. And it's not just the calls anymore. It's the way the world reacts to me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror the other day. My reflection didn't move the same way I did. It tilted its head slightly, just like the figures did. And when I reached out to touch the glass, the mark on my hand flared to life, glowing, twisting, pulsing with energy, like it was calling out to something, or someone. And the worst part? I didn't feel afraid. I felt right. Like this was how things were meant to be. I'm not Alex anymore. Not really. I'm part of the station now, and it's part of me. I can hear it calling to me even when the phone isn't ringing. I can feel its pulse in the air, its hum in my thoughts. I think it's waiting for me to call someone else. Someone like you. And now here you are. You've made it this far. You've listened to the story, the whispers, the warnings. I know what you're thinking. You think it's just a story, just words on a page. But I'm not telling you a story anymore. I'm speaking to you directly. You're already part of it. The station has been calling to you this whole time, hasn't it? You've felt it, haven't you? The hum in the back of your mind, the way the shadows feel a little too long, a little too sharp, the way the air changes when you hear the static, the ringing. That's not coincidence. It's already begun. You can't see it, but it's there, in the corner of your eye, in the reflection of your window, in the way you're reading this right now. You think you're safe. You think you're just reading a story, listening to a warning. But what if I told you the story wasn't finished? What if I told you you're the next one? The phone will ring. It always does, but this time it won't be for me. It'll be for you. You'll hear the static first, like a hum in the air. Then the voice will come through, low and cold. Midnight mix with Alex. And when you answer, when you pick up the phone, you'll realize what's been happening. You'll understand. You won't be able to stop it. You won't be able to escape it. The station has already marked you, and now you're the one it's waiting for. The cycle is already in motion, and now it's your turn to answer the call.